this brief video tutorial, I'll be walking through end of chapter problem 5.9, letters A and D, found on pages 153 and 154 of your course textbook. You can see I've taken the time to transfer all of the known facts from the word problem into a new Microsoft Excel workbook in this gray shaded area, but we'll go through each one of those. So the first sentence reads that the Grandview Clinic has fixed costs of $2 million. And I've put the label of fixed cost in column A and the value $2 million in column B. And the reason why I wanted to separate the label from the value is that we'll be using all of these values here in order to do the calculations in our P&L. So it's best to keep them separate instead of just putting a space between fixed costs and $2 million. Whenever possible, you always want to use references to cells containing numbers in formulas and not have to type in manually a formula containing numbers. So let's move on to the second part of that sentence, which is that Grandview Clinic has an average variable cost rate of $15 per visit. So ABC here represents average variable cost. It's a per visit rate. It's $15. Now remember, variable costs are determined by volume. So if you have one visit, you're going to have $15. If you have two visits, you're going to have $30. So each visit, it takes $15 of cost in order to provide those services. This is in direct opposition to fixed costs, which means if you have one visit, it's going to cost the Grandview Clinic $2 million regardless in order to have the fixed equipment available to provide services. If they have 10,000 visits, it's still probably going to cost $2 million. So fixed and variable costs are the way cost behavior is described. The second sentence on page 153 reads, its sole payer, an HMO, has proposed an annual capitation payment of $150. So you can see here, annual capitation payment, $150. Now I think it's important to note annual in parentheses here because based on my experience, oftentimes HMOs will pay on a per monthly basis. So you'll see an acronym, a PMPM, which represents payment per member per month. And that's because it gives patients flexibility to move from one clinic to the next, at least on a monthly basis. So the payments are provided on a monthly basis. So here this means that regardless, in the Grandview Clinic's case example, in this case it's $150 for the entire year. So it doesn't matter how many visits any one of the patients that Grandview Clinic cares for, comes in for, Grandview Clinic is still going to get paid $150. So you could have patient 1 come in 0 times, and Grandview Clinic is still going to get paid $150 for the year. Patient number 2 comes in 1 time in that whole year, and Grandview Clinic is going to get paid $150. Patient 3 may come in 50 times in a year, and Grandview Clinic is still only going to get paid $150 for that patient. That's how capitation payment works. And the second part of that sentence then is the number of members Grandview Clinic has been assigned, and in this case it's 20,000 members. The last sentence is that past experience indicates that the population served will average 2 visits per year. So here's visits per member per year, and that's 2. So we have all of the information that we need in order to come up with this base case P&L, which is what you're going to be doing in letter A. So a base case P&L is fairly straightforward in terms of its layout. You're always going to have revenues, you're always going to have costs, and you're always going to have a profit. In this case, the base case P&L is also going to include a total contribution margin line, which is just your revenues less your variable costs. Not all base case P&Ls will have a total contribution line specifically carved out, but it will have the other pieces. Now, variable costs and fixed costs may not always be labeled variable costs and fixed costs. In its place, you will have most oftentimes actual labels for the expense, whether it's salary expense, administrative supply expense, med-surg supply expense. So you're not necessarily going to see these categories of variable costs and fixed costs, but in this class, in this example, we're trying to keep it very simple, very straightforward, and that's why you see variable costs and fixed costs in red. So in order to calculate revenues in a capitation environment, what you need to do is take those number of members that you have times what you're getting paid for each one of those members. So it's simple, members times the annual per member capitation payment rate. And so you get $3 million. So that's what your anticipated revenues are. So as you can see, when a healthcare organization is working with a lot of capitated contracts, it's actually more in a better position to predict more accurately the revenues because it's a contracted rate. It doesn't matter how many visits someone comes in for under a fee-for-service environment, you would get paid the more visits somebody comes and sees you. So revenues is really a guess on volume, and therefore from volume you can guess the revenues. But in a capitated environment, you are actually working under a contract with a specific contracted rate on a per member basis. And so again, revenues is a little bit more straightforward and a little more predictable. For total variable costs, we need to figure out how many visits are potentially going to be seen by Grandview Clinic physicians, providers, and then what the per visit average variable cost rate is. So this equation, if it doesn't seem obvious, is you take the number of members times the number of visits per member per year, and that way you get an understanding of how many total visits across all the members that you might be seeing. So you can probably do that in your head. That would be 40,000 visits, B5 times B6. But it's not enough to know the number of visits. You need to know the average, you need to know the total variable cost. So you need to take the members times the visits per member per year times the average variable cost rate, which we were given in the problem. Whoops. This times, and then the average variable cost rate. So you can see the equation here. So the average variable cost rate of $15 per visit yields us a total variable cost of $600,000 across all 20,000 members, assuming that they will, on average, each patient will come in 2 times a year. So the total contribution margin equation is fairly straightforward. It's the $3 million less the $600,000, so $2.4 million is your contribution margin. Your fixed costs are just the $2 million. There's nothing fancy about that. But instead of typing in $2 million in this cell E5, I'm referencing it back to cell B2, and so I'm saying equals cell B2. And that's just in case if I ever wanted to modify the contents in B2 to, let's say, $3 million, I could do that and it would automatically update the formula in my P&L statement. I wouldn't have to manually adjust any kind of formulas. So then the profit is fairly straightforward again. It's going to be your total contribution margin less the fixed costs. And so when you assume these conditions, you're going to anticipate a profit of $400,000. Now, letter D in the example says, well, what if you can push your visits per member per year down to a 1.8 instead of 2? So your visits are going to be decreasing. Now watch what happens to the profit line when the visits per member per year are updated. So you can see the profits went up to $460,000, whereas before, if you look, it was $400,000. And notice I'm going to toggle back and forth again. I'm back to 2 visits, the original base case P&L. Watch what happens also to your variable costs and your contribution margin, which is going to affect the profit. You can see that variable costs went down, meaning that your since you only have 1.8 visits instead of the 2, your total number of visits times the average cost rate per visit has decreased, so you don't incur as many variable costs. Because you don't incur as many variable costs, your contribution margin is higher. Notice what didn't change. Your revenues didn't change, and neither did your fixed costs change. But your variable costs, your contribution margin, and therefore your profit has changed. I hope you found this example helpful. Thanks for watching.